Hi friends, Mr. Weimer here, back with our second installment of Fantastic Mr. Fox. Now, when we last left Mr. Fox, he and his family were trying to escape those horrible farmers. Let's see what happens next. Chapter 5. The Terrible Tractors. As the sun rose the next morning, Bogus and Bunce and Bean were still digging. They had dug a hole so deep you could have put a house into it. But they had not yet come to the end of the fox's tunnel. They were all very tired and cross. "Dang and blast," said Bogus. "Whose rotten idea was this?" "It's Bean's idea," said Bunce. Bogus and Bunce both stared at Bean. Bean took another swig of cider, then put the flask back into his pocket without offering it to the others. "Listen," he said angrily. "I want that fox. I'm going to get that fox. I'm not giving in till I've strung him up over my front porch." "We can't get him by digging, that's for sure," said the fat Bogus. "I've had enough of digging." Bunce, the little pot-bellied dwarf, looked up at Bean and said, "Have you got any more stupid ideas then?" "What?" said Bean. "I can't hear you." Bean never took a bath. He never even washed. As a result, his ear holes were clogged with all kinds of muck and wax and bits of chewing gum and dead flies and stuff like that. This made him deaf. "Speak louder," he said to Bunce, and Bunce shouted back, "Got any more stupid ideas?" Bean rubbed the back of his neck with a dirty finger. He had a boil coming there, and it itched. "What we need is this job," he said, "is machines. Mechanical shovels. We'll have them out here in 5 minutes with mechanical shovels." This was a pretty good idea, and the other two had to admit it. "All right then," said Bean, taking charge. "Bogus, you stay here and see that that fox doesn't escape. Bunce and I will go and fetch our machinery. If he tries to get out, shoot him quick." The long, thin Bean walked away. The tiny Bunce trotted after him. The fat Bogus stayed where he was with his gun pointing at the foxhole. Soon, 2 enormous caterpillar tractors with mechanical shovels on front ends came clanking into the wood. Bean was driving one, Bunce the other. The machines were both black. They were murderous, brutal-looking monsters, huge and scary. "Here we go, then," shouted Bean. "Get the fox," shouted Bunce. The machines went to work, biting huge mouthfuls of soil out of the hill. The big tree under which Mr. Fox had dug his hole in the first place was toppled like a matchstick. On all sides, rocks were sent flying and trees were falling and noise was deafening. Down in the tunnel, the foxes crouched, listening to the terrible clanging and banging overhead. "What's happening, Dad?" cried the smallest foxes. "What are they doing?" Mr. Fox didn't know what was happening or what they were doing. "It's an earthquake!" cried Mrs. Fox. "Look," said one of the small foxes, "our tunnel's gotten shorter. I can see daylight." They all looked around, and yes, the mouth of the tunnel was only a few feet away from them now. And in the circle of daylight, beyond, they could see the huge 2 tunnels of tractors almost on top of them. "Tractors!" shouted Mr. Fox, "and mechanical shovels. Dig for your lives. Dig, dig, dig." Chapter 6. The Race. Now there began a desperate race, the machines against the foxes. In the beginning, the hill looked like this. I don't know if you can see, but that's what the hill looks like. After about an hour, as the machines bit away more and more soil from the hilltop, it looked like this. Right there is what it looked like next. Sometimes the fox would gain a little ground, and the clanking noises would grow fainter and fainter, and Mr. Fox would say, "We're going to make it. I'm sure we are." But then, a few minutes later, the machines would come back and at them, and crunch of the mighty shovels would get louder and louder and louder. Once the foxes actually saw the sharp metal edge of one of the shovels as it scraped up the earth just behind them. "Keep going, my darlings, keep going," panted Mr. Fox. "Don't give up." "Keep going," the fat Bogus shouted to Bunce and Bean. "We'll get him any minute now." "Have you caught sight of him yet?" Bean called back. "Not yet," shouted Bogus, "but I think you're close." "I'll pick him up with my bucket," shouted Bunce. "I'll chop him to pieces." But by lunchtime, the machines were still at it, and so were the poor foxes. The hill now looked like this. Poor hill. The farmers didn't stop for lunch. They were too keen to finish the job. "Hey there, Mr. Fox," yelled Bunce, leaning out of his tractor. "We're coming to get you now." "You've had your last chicken," yelled Bogus. "You'll never come prowling around my farm again." A sort of madness had taken hold of the three men. The tall, skinny Bean and dwarfish, pot-bellied Bunce were driving their machines like maniacs, racing the motors and making the shovels dig at a terrific speed. The fat Bogus was hopping about like a dervish and shouting, "Faster! Faster! Faster!" By 5 o'clock in the afternoon, this is what had happened to the hill. It was no more than a hole in the earth. The hole the machines had dug was like a crater of a volcano. It was such an extraordinary sight that crowds of people came rushing out from their surrounding villages to take a look. They stood on the edge of the crater and stared down at Bogus and Bunce and Bean. "Hey there, Bogus. What's going on?" "We're after a fox." "You must be crazy." People jeered and laughed, but this only made the three farmers more furious and more obstinate and more determined than ever not to give up until they had caught that fox. Chapter 7. We'll never let him go. At 6 o'clock in the evening, Bean switched off the motor of his tractor and climbed down from the driver's seat. Bunce did the same. Both men had had enough. They were tired and stiff from driving the tractors all day. They were also very hungry. Slowly, they walked over to the small fox's hole in the bottom of the huge crater. Bean's face was purple with rage. Bunce was cursing the fox with dirty words that cannot be printed or said here. Bogus came waddling up. "Dang and blast that filthy, stinking fox," he said. "What the heck are we going to do now?" "I'll tell you what we're going to do," Bean said. "We won't let him go." "We'll never let him go," Bunce declared. "Never, never, never," cried Bogus. "Did you hear that, Mr. Fox?" yelled Bean, bending low and shouting down the hole. "It's not over until we've got you up here." Whereupon the three men all shook hands with one another and swore a solemn oath that they would not go back to their farms until the fox had been caught. "What's the next move?" asked Bunce, the pot-bellied dwarf. "We're sending you down the hole to fetch him up," said Bean. "Down you go, you miserable midget." "Not me!" screamed Bunce, running away. Bean made a sickly smile. When he smiled, you saw his scarlet gums. You saw more gums than teeth. "Then there's only one thing to do," he said. "We starve him out. We came here day and night watching the hole. He'll come out in the end. He'll have to." So Bogus and Bunce and Bean sent messages down to their farms asking for tents, sleeping bags, and supper. Chapter 8. The foxes begin to starve. That evening, 3 tents were put up in the crater on the hill. One for Bogus, one for Bunce, and one for Bean. The tents surrounded Mr. Fox's hole, and the 3 farmers sat outside their tents eating their supper. Bogus had 3 boiled chickens smothered in dumplings. Bunce had 6 donuts filled with disgusting goose liver paste, and Bean had 2 gallons of cider. All 3 of them kept their guns beside them. Bogus picked up a steaming chicken and held it close to the fox's hole. "Can you smell this, Mr. Fox?" he shouted. "Lovely, tender chicken. Why don't you come on up and get it?" The rich scent of chicken wafted down the tunnel to where the foxes were crouching. "Oh, Dad," said one of the small foxes, "couldn't we just sneak up and snatch it out of his hand?" "Don't you dare," said Mrs. Fox. "That's just what they want you to do." "But we're hungry," they cried. "How long will it be till we get something to eat?" Their mother didn't answer them, nor did their father. There was no answer to give. As darkness fell, Bunce and Bean switched on the powerful headlights of the 2 tractors and shone them onto the hole. "Now," said Bean, "we'll take it in turn to keep watch. One watches while 2 sleep, and so on through the night." Bogus said, "What if the fox digs a hole right through the hill and comes out on the other side? You didn't think of that one, did you?" "Of course I did," said Bean, pretending he had. "Go on then, tell us the answer," said Bogus. Bean picked something small and black out of his ear and flicked it away. "How many men have you got working on your farm?" he asked. 35, said Bogus. "I've got 36, Bunce said. "And I've got 37, Bean said. "That makes 108 men altogether. We must order them to surround the hill. Each man will have a gun and a flashlight. There will be no escape then for the Mr. Fox." So the order went down to the farms, and that night 108 men formed a tight ring around the bottom of the hill. They were armed with sticks and guns and hatchets and pistols and all sorts of other horrible, horrible weapons. This made it quite impossible for a fox, or indeed for any other animal, to escape from the hill. The next day, the watching and waiting went on. Bogus and Bunce and Bean sat upon small stools, staring at the fox's hole. They didn't talk much. They just sat there with their guns on their laps, waiting. Every so often, Mr. Fox would creep a little closer toward the mouth of the tunnel and take a sniff. Then he would creep back again and say, "They're still out there." "Are you quite sure?" Mrs. Fox would ask. "Positive," said Mr. Fox. "I can smell that man Bean a mile away. He stinks." Chapter 9. Mr. Fox has a plan. For 3 days and 3 nights this waiting game went on. "How long can a fox go without food or water?" Bogus asked on the 3rd day. "Not much longer," Bean told him. "He'll make a run for it soon. He'll have to." Bean was right. Down in the tunnel, the foxes were slowly but surely getting hungrier and hungrier. "If only we could just have a tiny sip of water," said one of the small foxes. "Oh, Dad, can't you do something?" "Can we make a dash for it, Dad? We'd have a little chance, wouldn't we?" "No chance at all," snapped Mrs. Fox. "I refuse to let you go up there and face those guns. I'd sooner you stay down here in peace." Mr. Fox had not spoken for a long time. He had been sitting quite still, his eyes closed, not even hearing what the others were saying. Mrs. Fox knew that he was trying desperately to think of a way out. And now, as she looked at him, she saw him stir himself and get slowly to his feet. He looked back at his wife. There was a little spark of excitement dancing in his eyes. "What is it, darling?" said Mrs. Fox quickly. "What is it?" "I've just had a bit of an idea," Mr. Fox said carefully. "What?" they cried. "Oh, Dad, what is it?" "Come on," said Mrs. Fox. "Tell us quickly." "Well," said Mr. Fox. Then he stopped and sighed and sadly shook his head. He sat down again. "It's no good," he said. "It won't work after all." "Why not, Dad? Why not?" "Because it means more digging, and we aren't any of us strong enough for that after 3 days and nights without food or water." "Yes, we are, Dad. Yes, we are," cried the small foxes, jumping up and running to their father. "We can do it. You see if we can't. So can we. You can do it." Mr. Fox looked at the 4 small foxes and he smiled. "What fine children I have," he thought. "They are starving to death and they haven't had a drink for 3 days, but they are still undefeated. I must not let them down. We will succeed." I suppose we could give it a try," he said. "Let's go, Dad, let's go. Tell us what you want us to do." Slowly, Mrs. Fox got to her feet. She was suffering more than any of them from the lack of food and water. She was very weak. "I'm sorry," she said, "but I don't think I'm going to be much help." "You stay right where you are, my love," said Mr. Fox. "We can handle this by ourselves." Chapter 10. Bogus's Chicken House, number 1. "This time we must go in a very special direction," said Mr. Fox, pointing sideways and downward. So he and his 4 children started to dig once again. The work went much more slowly now, yet they kept at it with great courage, and little by little the tunnel began to grow. "Dad, I wish you would tell us where we're going," said one of the children. "I dare not do that," said Mr. Fox, "because this place I am hoping to get to is so marvelous that if I describe it to you, you would go crazy with excitement. And then, if we fail to get there, which is very possible, you would be so disappointed. I don't want to raise your hopes too much, my darlings." For a long, long time they kept on digging. For how long, they did not know, because there were no days and no nights down there in the murky tunnel. But at last Mr. Fox gave the order to stop. "I think," he said, "we had better take a peep upstairs now and see where we are. I know where I want to be, but I can't possibly be sure where we are." Slowly, wearily, the foxes began to slope and tunnel up toward the surface. Up and up and up it went, until suddenly they came to something hard above their heads, and they couldn't go up any further. Mr. Fox reached up to examine this hard thing. "It's wood," he whispered. "It's wood. It's wood planks." "What does that mean, Dad?" "It means, unless I'm very much mistaken, that we are right underneath somebody's house," whispered Mr. Fox. "Be very quiet now, while I take a peek." Carefully, Mr. Fox began pushing up one of the floorboards. The board creaked most terribly, and they all ducked down, waiting for something awful to happen. But nothing did. So Mr. Fox pushed up a second board, and then, very cautiously, he poked his head up through the gap. He let out a shriek of excitement. "I've done it! I've done it!" he yelled. "I've done it first time! I've done it! I've done it!" He pulled himself up through the gap in the floor and started prancing and dancing with joy. "Come on up," he sang out. "Come on up and see where you are, my darlings. What a sight for a hungry fox! Hooray, hooray, we've made it!" The 4 small foxes scrambled up out of the tunnel, and what a fantastic sight it was that now met their eyes. They were in a huge shed, and the whole place was teeming with chickens. There were white chickens and brown chickens and black chickens by the thousand. "Bogus's chicken house number 1," cried Mr. Fox. "It's exactly what I was aiming at. I hit it, slap in the middle. First time, isn't that fantastic? And if I must say so, rather clever." The small foxes went wild with excitement. They started running around in all directions, chasing the chickens. "Wait," ordered Mr. Fox. "Wait! Don't lose your heads. Stand back. Calm down. Let's do this properly. First of all, everyone have a drink of water." They all ran over to the chicken's drinking trough and lapped up the lovely cool water. Then Mr. Fox chose 3 of the plumpest hens, and with a clever flick of his jaws, he instantly got them ready. "Back to the tunnel," he ordered. "Come on. No fooling around. The quicker you move, the quicker you shall have something to eat, and for your poor mother to have something to eat as well." One after another they climbed down through the hole in the floor, and soon they were all standing once again in the dark tunnel. Mr. Fox reached up and pulled the floorboards back into place. He did this with great care. He did it so that no one could tell that they had ever been moved or anyone had been there. "My son," he said, giving the 3 plump hens to the biggest of his 4 children, "run back with these to your mother. Tell her to prepare a feast. Tell her the rest of us will be coming along swiftly, as soon as we have made a few other little arrangements." I think that's a perfect place to stop for today. I'll see you all tomorrow. Take care.